Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland, and welcome to Night Fright. Tonight, a very special guest. You've seen him before on UFO Hunters. He's also editor of UFO magazine. None other than Bill Birnes is here. But let me just start off. We're broadcasting now from a brand new studio. This is our first broadcast in Kingston, Ontario. We've moved, that's right, folks, from Sudbury, Ontario, down along the lakeshore of Lake Ontario. And I'm looking out now at this grandiose site right across Lake Ontario. The sky is pitch black. Right on this sky, folks, are these little dots of stars. It looks amazing. Now, one can only wonder what lies beyond the stars. Many people right here on Earth have seen thousands, not millions, of sightings, especially in the United States. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to be looking directly at those geographical locations where many people have seen the sightings. Now, this is a terrific book. If you're planning a trip, this has all the locations of all the sightings, and you're going to want to get this book because if you're planning a trip, it's great even with the family and the kids. If you're planning a trip across the states, none better than to stop off and see a place where an actual sighting of a UFO has taken place. And we're going to be getting to that in just a second with Bill Birnes. It's going to be a wild one, folks. Strap in and hang on. Here we go.
There is a time to question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Welcome, one and all. I'm Brent Holland. Welcome to Night Fright. Tonight, a very special guest, Bill Birnes, is with us. He's joining us. Of course, Bill Birnes is the author of UFO magazine, and he is, of course, one of the hosts of UFO Hunters, which can be seen right here in Canada on the Outdoor Life Network in the States, if you're watching from the States right now, of course, on the History Channel. He's got a brand new book out called Aliens in America, and what it is a geographic location, point by point by point, of all the sightings across the states. So if you are planning a trip, why not stop off and see some of these great locations, these historic locations? And that's where we're going to go right away. I want to first of all welcome Bill to the show. Thank you, Bill, for joining us. He's on Skype all the way from Buffalo. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Brent. It's good to be here on a winter evening.
Absolutely, folks. Get comfy. Get that coffee going. Get a hot chocolate going, even better. Snuggle into your favorite chair. Pull a comforter up. What a better way to spend an evening than listening to Bill Birnes talk about UFOs. Bill, let's jump in right away. This book has fascinated me because I have just returned from New York City, and one of the chapters here is called the Hudson Valley. I'm just flipping through it now. Of course, I've got all my research here. The Hudson Valley is well, let's talk about the sightings that we're seeing there. And I just drove along there, and I'm telling you, folks, it is eerie. There's mountains on either side. You're kind of in the valley where the highway drives along. Most of the places along there are desolate. It's a spooky place. You're going to want to visit this place. Can we talk about the Hudson Valley, please?
Sure. Well, the Hudson Valley, that whole area, this is north of New York City, winding along the Hudson River. And as you say, you're correct. It's between two hills, so you're kind of in a gorge, a river gorge. The mysterious, the mysterious goings-on in the Hudson Valley date all the way back to the 17th century when the Dutch first came here after Henry Hudson sailed up the Hudson River. And it is an incredibly eerie place. It's the home of things like the Headless Horseman and all kinds of spooky stuff. Rip Van Winkle, the mysterious Dutch bowling, the 10 pins at night over Thunder Mountain. In the 1980s, there were a series of lights on successive nights that began turning up in the night sky, and they were in these strange triangular formations, in some cases crescent formations. And gradually, folks began going out to look at them at night until it became kind of like a scene out of a Spielberg movie, nightly occurrences. Well, here's what's so weird. You know, if you look at what are the major prongs of something that you can say, okay, well, this is evidence of some kind of an event, whether it's extraterrestrials, time travelers, interdimensional, we don't know. But something. So one of the big things is multiple witnesses. That's first of all. So you've got witnesses corroborating witnesses. Two, high credibility in witnesses. There were police officers who saw this, pilots who saw this, air traffic controllers who saw this. So, I mean, it's one thing to say, you know, Joe Sixpack staggers out of his house after a heavy night of watching football, Canadian football, no less, staggers out of his house, looks up in the sky, sees some lights, hey, look at that. I mean, this is not that. You've got multiple witnesses, police officers, pilots, retired military, firefighters, air traffic controllers. These are folks who are used to seeing things in the night sky and tend to know what they're looking at. And if they can't identify it, then it's a UFO. But what other events were taking place? Well, in addition to that, for me, one of the big things is that the government or the powers that be or the quasi-government jumps in to say, oh, here's the explanation for it, and here's why you're all fools. So there was a group of pilots called the Stormville Flyers, and they claimed that they were hoaxing the whole thing by flying their planes in a formation very slowly, low enough to the ground so folks could see the lights. Well, guess what? A number of problems with that. First of all, the people who saw the lights reported there was no noise. And the lights weren't just moving at a steady pace, they were hovering. They were floating. Well, if you're flying a small plane in a tight wing-to-wing formation, right, guess what you're going to hear? Noise. Where we live, we're between two airports. And when those planes go over, private planes go over, there's a private airport near us. When these planes go over, they're not noiseless, okay? These are slow-flying, prop-driven planes, and you hear that whine of that engine. Now, multiply it by 5 and 6 and 7 planes. You're going to hear it. Nobody heard anything. Oh, we were flying so high. If you're flying so high, all you're going to see are the red and green nav lights and the flashing lights off a plane. You would know from the flashing lights. So that explanation just fell apart. Then one of those lights, one of those formations of lights, actually floated over the Indian Point nuclear power plant. And you'd say, oh, so what? So some guard at some power plant, they saw a light. Hey, you know, what else is new? You know, the guy probably had a little too much Utica Club. Well, or Molson. So, but unfortunately, that was not an easy explanation because as the object flew over, the power at the plant was interrupted. The security systems at the plant were interrupted, and more than one person saw it. And in fact, the head of security comes on and says, well, we had an incident. So you've got multiple witnesses, multiple locations. This was so intriguing to one of the most famous, celebrated UFO investigators, J. Allen Hynek, who had worked for Project Blue Book, and then suddenly did a 180 after the Holland, Michigan sightings. Hynek joined in the investigation with Phil Imbrogno, now Dr. Phil Imbrogno from MIT. They joined in the investigations. And suddenly people were talking about multiple lights, multiple locations, seeing humanoids, alien abductions, more than just a sighting of lights. Well, the Hudson Valley sightings, that incident, that flap in the 80s into the 90s, has become one of the most important sightings on the East Coast of America. And folks, you know what? Folks can drive up there. If you're coming down from Canada, was it 5 hours away?
That's all. Yep.
A day's drive, nothing at all. From New Jersey, from New York, from Philadelphia, 3 hours away. There are plenty of things to do, plenty of places to stay. It's a wonderful trip for a weekend for a family.
That's what I like about this book, folks. This discusses all those points of interest, UFO sightings, but it also gives you a whole range of places to stay. It's almost like a travel guide, if you will, in many respects. It also has little block boxes that fill in gaps, tidbits of the area, places to eat. For sure, I am taking this book, folks, on my next journey down to New York City. As you know, I jot down between New York City and Canada all the time. And the next time I go down, I'm stopping at a lot of these places. And of course, the book is called Aliens in America. You recognize our guest tonight. He's right here. And you've seen him on UFO Hunters. And of course, he's the editor of UFO Magazine. And as always, all that information to connect to both websites will be on the www.nightfrightshow.com website, as well as a link for a place to go and buy the book from the comfort of your own home. As I said before, we've just moved from Sudbury. This is our first broadcast out of this new studio location, and I'm liking it because I'm looking right out now, right out a big picture window at Lake Ontario. And of course, it's just so picturesque with the stars and the black night. Great night tonight, folks, to settle in, get comfy, and listen to our guest, Bill Birnes. We're going to talk about some more. Now, let me just read some of this quotes here. Now, this is Area 51. Now, most folks that are watching the show right now are familiar with Area 51, but let's listen to what he's written here. Question: where is the best place in the United States to see a UFO? Answer: the desert in Rachel, Nevada, outside the top secret Air Force base known as Area 51. Bill, can we talk about Area 51? Because I know a lot of people have heard about this mysterious government mystery, I guess you could call it, for lack of a better word. Top secret, as everybody knows, yet everybody seems to know about it. Can we talk about Area 51 and the chances of spotting a UFO there?
Well, here's what's so strange. Now, had we not seen one ourselves, I've heard plenty of stories, Fred. A lot of this comes from people who have driven out in the desert along the border of Area 51. You can do that. It's public land, public highway. You can do that. And they've seen, in one case, this one person, it's an incredible story. It's 3 a.m, and he's making the run from across Nevada. And he's not out to see a UFO. That's the fun part about it. This is not a UFO freak. It's somebody making the run across Nevada, and he's driving near it, and this huge triangular craft literally pulls up, and then just hovers above his car and tracks his car, then kind of speeds off. And the person was like freaking out. What was that?
Me too.
Now, when we went there with UFO Hunters back in 2009, we did a couple of things. One, you could actually look into air. First of all, you cannot get on the base. And there are signs that basically say, and I'll tell you some stories about that. It's so secret. There are signs that say that lethal force is authorized. Lethal force. So it's not just some guy comes up and says, get off the base. The local sheriff pops up, and says, hey, I'm throwing you in the pokey for trespassing here. No. Guards, snipers are authorized to use lethal force. Buried along the roads leading up to the gates on the base are sensors. So they know where you're coming. I mean, Western powers have an incredibly sophisticated sensor ability. Mm-hmm. There are cameras. There are microphones. So you're not going to go up stealth in some kind of black ninja outfit and sneak onto the base. Not going to happen. Well, I heard a story from somebody who should know, who was in one of the secret services, clandestine services, mm-hmm. who said he had a friend who was Special Operations Forces, U.S. Army, and Delta Force, basically was hired to be a sniper at the base.
Wow.
And this person could hear these two school teachers talking. And the rule was, if you're on the base, you get shot. And the person had these people in his sights. So obviously a scope that allowed them to see them close up and personal. Had them in the crosshairs, and his orders were shoot to kill. Now, he heard them talking about going back and telling the third graders and sixth graders about this, and he did not fire.
Thank they left. God.
And his CO, his boss, calls him in and says, you didn't fire. What is wrong with you? And the guy says, I want to go back to my Delta Force assignment. I want to go back to protecting America, not killing school teachers for coming onto a base. Send me back. And they did. They sent him back to Delta Force. They want people who will kill on command. That's how secret this base is. But there is a mountain peak called Tikaboo Peak, which is not easy to climb. It's a 20-degree incline. So if you're going up there with equipment, it is literally, K7 it's not. But if you're carrying a big 300-millimeter camera lens, it's heavy. Went up there. We filmed into the base at sunrise. So the sun is coming up over our backs. So you're getting the morning sun coming in. We saw a hangar so big, so long. What could it be, right? You could see the same thing from Google Earth. Now, we also set up 24-hour surveillance cameras, night shutter cameras, all around our perimeter near the base. And we picked up a craft zigzagging in the sky. And you'd say, how do you know it's a craft, Bill? Come on, you're jumping to conclusions. What if it's a shooting star? What if it's a meteorite? Well, you know what? We thought it was a meteorite. Then we did a frame-by-frame analysis. And we said, look, the thing went out. So it obviously went out behind the mountains. Wrong. It went out before it touched the mountain peaks. So in other words, it was self-illuminating, not a meteorite picking up sunlight. And it moved in an erratic way. It wasn't a straight line. And if folks want to go and look at that episode from season 2, it's on DVD, you can do it, and you'll see the UFO yourself. So we actually saw a UFO over Area 51. But there are the Bob Lazar stories. Bob Lazar, the physicist, he self-described physicist, but let's for argument's sake say, you know what, it's an open question. But George Knapp, the radio host in the United States, the coast-to-coast host, seems to have resolved it by finding records of Bob Lazar at Los Alamos and other places. Anyway, Bob Lazar brought his friend John Lear from the Davis Learjet family, one of the most famous CIA pilots ever, John Lear out there, and they videotaped this UFO over the base. Showed up exactly when Lazar said it would. And he brought his friend out there, Gene Huff, and he brought his wife out there, and of course he lost his security clearance for that. But the point is that videos exist of UFOs over Area 51, one of our most secret air bases, not just for the United States Air Force, but for NATO as well.
That's right. Yeah. Now, this begs a question. By the way, folks, we're speaking with Bill Birnes tonight. I'm riveted to this seat, as always, and I'm being specifically quiet because when you have a man of this stature on your show, you be quiet and you listen and you learn. And that's what I'm hoping you folks out there listening are getting right now. His new book we're discussing tonight is called Aliens in America. I urge you all to get it. Easy way to get it, as always, www.nightfrightshow.com. untimely.com. The link will be there. Just click on the book cover. As always, we'll take you right to a spot. You can order the book. It'll arrive at the comfort of your own home. Bill, this begs a question. You mentioned Bob Lazar, of course, and did he indicate that this UFO could have been an American stealth fighter, a secret weapon of some sort, something along the cutting edge of technology other than extraterrestrial?
Well, he said it was a reverse engineered craft from extraterrestrial technology.
Explosive.
So this wasn't just an ET craft that we captured, brought down, the two co-pilots were flying it around. No, this was like one step further. It was a craft that we had, and then we reverse engineered that craft into something else. And so it was ours, but ours from theirs. But here's the fascinating part about it. It was using a propulsion system that was so far beyond our technology that we didn't know what to do with it. Now, John Lear explained it, and this is what's so exciting about it. John Lear said that Lazar told him, so this is, of course, secondhand information, that the craft was actually, the fuel for this craft was an element called element 115. Now, element 115 means it's got 115 protons. It is off our charts. We don't have it. We would have to fabricate it by bombarding something with protons enough to build it up. Supposedly, the propulsion system worked thusly, that element, and there's only a small amount, I mean, let's say the size of a pencil, was bombarded with protons to bump it up to element 116, that's 116 protons, at which point it instantly degraded. But it degraded with such intensity and energy that that beam could be focused. And that beam didn't shoot out the way a conventional rocket propulsion engine does. That beam pointed forward, and it pulled space. It curved space and pulled space and time towards it. So it didn't move through space and time. Space and time moved around it, and that's what gave it the incredible ability to traverse light years in seconds. But even that's an incorrect thing to say, Brent, because there were no seconds since time was passing through it. Now imagine a craft that can do that. And so John Lear explained this, and of course we were riveted. We just sat there. We'd never heard anything like this before. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. You'd say, Bill, come on, element 115, moving space and time. Tell me one fact, a fact. Don't tell me speculation. Don't tell me hypothesis. I want one fact from somebody that tells you that there's some evidence to support this. Well, if you believe that evidence would be testimony from a police officer or evidence from thousands of UFO witnesses, it's this. I'll tell you one story which told me what's going on. Now remember, it's pulling time around it. Doesn't have to be going at hyperlight speed, but that's how it's traversing distance. Now, this craft is also generating a huge static electrical field as it goes through wherever it's going through. It's passing over a police car in Liberty Township, Ohio, just right near the lake. Okay, it's passing over this police car. And an officer is seeing this craft overhead, huge, seeing this craft overhead. And he's calling in to his dispatch, his 911 dispatch. Suddenly, the radio goes dead, the engine goes dead. The craft passes overhead. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that when an engine on a car, a basic, standard, early 20th century, because they haven't changed that much in 100 years, internal combustion gasoline engine, right? Spark in the cylinder, explodes, whether it drives the crankshaft, drives the engine. Okay, now, when that engine cuts out, how does the engine start up again? You've got to restart it. Use a key, use a crank if it's 1905, but still, you got to restart it.
That's right.
The car's engine and the radio cut out. Suddenly, the craft passes overhead, and the police sergeant says the engine started up again. And what's worse and more intriguing, what he thought was 30 seconds turns out to be 15 minutes.
Wow.
So, temporal distortion. Now, I will tell you that every single witness that I have spoken to who has a relatively close encounter with an unidentified craft like this has always remembered vaguely, gee, that's funny. I thought it was like seconds, but it was like a half hour, an hour. We're not talking about missing time, alien abduction. We're just talking about temporal distortion. That I can tell you stories in the Phoenix Lights. Dr. Lynn Kitai actually took rolls of film of the object. Didn't remember she'd taken them until years later when Dr. Bruce Maccabee found the rolls of film and said, when did you take this? And he had the time stamp on the film, so he knew that this was taken during a time that she didn't remember it. Now, take that and correlate that with the idea that this craft is dragging time and space around it. And you suddenly get this very, very strange correlation between what Bob Lazar described and what witnesses, everyday witnesses describe. And here's one more log for the fire. So Bob Lazar, at first, in his introduction, can't figure out how this thing is powered. What makes this thing run, right? He's at Area 51. So they walk him up to a room, and they say, look through the window. He's looking at a candle that's flickering, right? They say, keep looking. Somebody goes away. Suddenly, the candle stops. Just stops.
Just like that.
Just stops. And Lazar says, how'd you make the candle stop? And the person says, we didn't. It's still flickering.
Oh, my God.
Well, if it's flickering, how come I can't see it? The candle didn't stop. Time did.
Time stopped.
Now,
oh, man.
Imagine a propulsion system that is so far advanced that inside that envelope that's created, time and space stop because they're being brought around you. Imagine the power. Imagine being able to vector that craft anywhere you want to, not just through space, not just to Alpha Centauri or Sirius or Orion or Deneb, but imagine being able to vector it to any point in time if you have the navigation system that allows it.
Wow.
A map. Imagine that. Now imagine that as a weapon.
Oh.
Okay?
It's the way, isn't it, though, eh?
Why do you think the Nazis, in 1945, as
Yes,
the
sir.
Soviet army was closing in on Poland, where the Nazis had this bell-shaped object, why do you think even in the closing weeks of the war, they knew they were defeated, they knew they were...
That's right.
The Nazi high command, the German high command, the Wehrmacht, the general staff, that's why there was an Operation Valkyrie to assassinate Hitler. They knew that they would lose the war once Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, failed, once they were retreating. In fact, concentration camp victims have told me that they actually stopped sending inmates, a tragic story, to the crematoria because they were using the crematoria to burn the bodies of German soldiers because they didn't want to overwhelm the German homeland, the Vaterland, by having bodies turn up from the Russian front. So, I mean, that's That's how they knew they were losing. All the German high command knew they were losing. Now, but there was a group of scientists in Poland, one of whom was an SS officer, an electrical engineer called Kurt Debus.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Kurt Debus, they all knew the war was lost. So their aim was not to let, but they also knew that if they could perfect this bell, die Glocke, the Nazi bell, and actually go back in time. Imagine going back in time and fighting the same war in 1920. Of course, that is the ultimate victory. Imagine changing history. Well, why do you think it's one of the reasons? Why do you think this is such a dreadful secret? We don't let it out because that's one of the corollary side effects of what this race of either extraterrestrials or human beings from the future or human beings from another place, by the way. That's what they brought. So in 1945, suddenly the bell disappears from the Riza Mountains in Poland, from the Owl Mountains in Poland, disappears. And in 1965, a bell-shaped object starts making a long, sweeping S-curve over Lake Ontario, Lake Superior, gradually over Michigan, and finally Lake Ontario, and finally coming to rest in western Pennsylvania in a controlled landing. The witnesses in December 1965 who see this all gather. They see this thing coming down. It's not a meteor hurling out of the sky in a trajectory. It's only making an S-curve, stopping, going in another direction. Within minutes, unmarked, unchevroned army units, military units, I'm calling them army, but military units are on scene. And NASA personnel are on scene. The head of the launch command at NASA in 1965 was an electrical engineer called Kurt Debus, the very same Kurt Debus who was in command of the Bell Project in Poland 20 years earlier. What do you think? Coincidence? I don't think so.
Not a chance. Not a chance. Folks, I'm riveted to this seat tonight. This is an incredible story. It's an incredible guest we have on tonight. Of course, it's Bill Birnes. You recognize the face. We're discussing his book. We got off track a little bit, but I want to continue on this because this is absolutely fascinating. Just let me give you a brief synopsis of the book. If you're traveling anywhere, this is a series of places where UFO sightings, including the one we just discussed, have been cited. All those sightings are their geographical locations, places to stay if you're planning a tour across the country. Great book to get. It's called Aliens in America. Of course, the author is Bill Birnes, who's our guest tonight. Bill, I'm going to jump back to this because Operation Paperclip, folks, just to let you know, that those of you that aren't familiar with Operation Paperclip took place at the end of the Second World War, where the Western powers went in and took as many German scientists and their notes as possible, including von Braun, who was credited with building the Saturn rocket that led to the lunar excursions, etc., etc. Do you feel this back engineering came from there, Bill, or do you think it came from somewhere else I'd like to discuss, which is Roswell, 1948?
Roswell it was July 1947.
47.
And you're looking at two separate streams in intervention. On the one hand, you have all these stories dating back to the 1930s. Remember, in NASA's own report on lunar anomalies, which anybody can get, go to nasa.gov, look for 500 years of lunar anomalies in the search bar. That report will come up. Enjoy it, because you will read about strange sightings of UFOs on the moon dating back to the time of Shakespeare.
Wow.
Christopher Marlowe the playwright Christopher Marlowe, Shakespeare's contemporary, reported seeing strange lights on the moon, the New England fire and brimstone, zeal of the land, busy Protestant preacher Cotton Mather, let them all be damned because only if you'll be elect, and there you are. He saw a UFO on the moon. In addition, going back 500 years, German scientists in the 1920s saw not only UFOs on the moon, but what they saw were lights on the lunar surface and lunar structures. So the point that I'm trying to make is that people, long before there was a Roswell, long before there was a 20th century, saw lights traveling around the moon and structures on the moon. Now, what's so fascinating is, to me at least, is that the Germans saw this. And even before the German astronomers saw these lights, there was a strange society of Russian women called the Vril. And the Vril is the name of a force, kind of like Chi or Chai, or actually the force from Star Wars. And they believed it was an extraterrestrial force that could be channeled. They were mediums. They were mediums in the spirit of Theosophy and Madame Blavatsky from the 19th century in Europe and America. So the Nazis loved this. They said, oh, a force that could be channeled. Maybe we can apply, and they said we can apply it to the history of the Aryan race. And they said that their race, the Aryans, stemmed from the planet Aldebaran. And they went all around the world looking for proof of the existence of the historicity of that alien race. Well, I have to tell you, one of the things they found was in the Vedic texts, the Vimana, the strange flying craft that was zapping each other and having fights, and they read about this in all these Vedic texts, the Bhagavad Gita, all these. Well, that's one stream. The other stream is, of course, in 1936, 10 years before Roswell, allegedly, reportedly, a flying disc crashed outside Freiburg, Germany. And that was reverse engineered by German scientists to become the Hanubu disc. And that was a German flying saucer. And we have video, early video, of the Germans experimenting with saucer-shaped craft. Now, we know from records that the Germans believed that they could send a human being into low Earth orbit, near Earth orbit, right at the fringe of the atmosphere, and then bring that pilot back. They were experimenting with pressure chambers at wellness facilities in Poland in the 1940s. They had rockets going into space, Werner von Braun from Peenemünde in 1942. So the Germans were very far ahead of us. Now, in truth, the Germans learned their rocketry right in the United States. They learned it from Robert Goddard in New Mexico outside of Roswell. So in other words, there are these multiple streams. So even before the reported crash at Roswell, we have stories of attempted alien contact, flying saucers, reverse engineering. When the incident happened at Roswell, and it almost is a mirror of the 1936 Freiburg crash, where a crescent-shaped object, and it wasn't just a crash, because we spoke to witnesses on UFO Hunters. Folks can go over to season 2. They can get the DVD and see Sergeant Earl Fulford, Staff Sergeant Fulford, the late Earl Fulford, talk about it. Army personnel at the 509th and Roswell saw flying saucers over the base weeks before the crash. They knew something was up. There was a crash, maybe 2 saucers, maybe there was a shoot down. We don't know what the cause of the crash was. The debris was recovered, and suddenly by the 1950s, we had transistors, we were developing integrated circuitry, units of the United States Army were kind of filtering in technology to all the right places for reverse engineering stuff. By the time the 1960s came around, we were in a golden age of expansion in terms of technology with lasers and like room-sized computers, not the old Brainiac with Edison tubes that always burnt out, but transistors and integrated circuitry. I mean, we were developing Kevlar, all kinds of things, all of this within the space of a few years. Now, the story is that it was technology from that Roswell craft that Arthur Trudeau and Army R&D got money for from the Senate Armed Services Committee to bring these patents into American industry. And that's the story of reverse engineering. So when you take that story on the one hand, the story of the Nazis on the other hand, and good old-fashioned technology we were developing, put those to bookend it, what you then have is kind of a perfect storm of technological development based on technology that might not have come from here.
Bill, is there any records of any contact with the Third Reich from extraterrestrial sources?
Yes. Herman Oberth, who was one of the scientists who came over in Operation Paperclip, very famous scientist, Herman Oberth, actually said, he was on record as saying, when they asked him, basically, Dr. Oberth, Professor Oberth, how did the Nazis get so far advanced? We all discovered air travel at the same time in the early year 1903. It wasn't as though you guys discovered it in 1850, right? We all discovered air travel at the same time. The combustion engine, was around the world by 1910. I mean, we're not talking about, there were tanks in World War I. The British and Germans had tanks. Where'd you guys get this? And you know what Herman Oberth said? We were helped by people from another world.
Folks, our guest today is Bill Birnes. We're talking about his new book, Aliens in America, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on the book cover as always, and you'll be able to pick it up. Urge you all to get it, especially if you're planning a trip across the United States. This has all the locations of all the sightings that were seen in the United States, and you can stop by and check out the locations, and many of them, as we've been discussing, like Roswell, the Hudson Valley. I travel back and forth between New York all the time, and I will be stopping off without hesitation at a lot of these sites. It gives you places to eat, and it gives you places to stay as well. Good family outing, I think. Historical facts there. But Bill, I wanted to talk some more about the back engineering and all those things that took place surrounding this, and why the perpetual cover-up in Washington. Why does it keep going? I mean, we're 2011 now. I think we're grown up enough and adult enough to handle the truth, don't you?
Are we? I mean,
okay.
You're the president of the United States. You're the Prime Minister of Canada, okay?
Yes,
right now, you're the Prime Minister of Canada. And you're told, because of some event that takes place, Mr. Prime Minister, here's the problem. And the explanation is that everything that you know and that the population of North America knows is wrong. And that human beings, as we know them, just that the stories of the Bible, they were kind of brought to us. They were created. They were fabricated. That anybody who studies theological history, particularly the history of the Bible, and I find theological history a fascinating course. I really do, a fascinating course of study. Because if you study it, you find out that the same political games were being played in the first century after Christ, and the second century after Christ, in the Council of Nicaea, in the councils of Rhodes. I mean, patriarchs and you're fighting over the primacy of Rome, the primacy of Alexandria. In point of fact, it became political. In point of fact, the historical Jesus, and we believe there was a real historical Jesus at the time of the Romans, never said, I want to start a new religion. He said, you guys are looking at the wrong thing here. You guys are looking at, okay, now. So it was Paul, it was the later apostles, the proselytizers, the evangelicals. The point is, there are more books left out of the religious canon Book of Enoch, all these books left out of the religious canon.
Gnostic Gospels, sure.
The Gnostic Gospels that are in. And among those, you have books about UFOs and the Nephilim and people who came from outer space. What does Nephilim mean? Does Nephilim mean giants in the earth the way it's translated in the King James? No. Nephilim meant those who fell from the skies.
That's right. Yeah.
They're fallen something. Angels? Demons? What is it? And by the way, Brent, have you ever asked yourself, you have all these Nephilim running around. You have Adam and Eve, you have Cain and Abel, and then there's a strange line in Genesis where the children of Adam and Eve are marrying the sons of men, the giants in the earth. Where'd they come from?
Exactly.
How'd they get there early? When did they take a train? I mean, it's like something's wrong. Then you've got the flood, okay? Flood always bothers me too. I mean, everything is killed in the flood. What about the fish? Well, anyway, so, I mean, fish, they didn't have fish on the ark. They stayed in the water. It's water. What about that? Don't you get? They're fish in water. Anyway, suddenly, by the time you get to the later text in the Bible, it's the story of David. Well, you don't even before the story of David, the Moses is leading the Israelites through what is today modern Jordan, and they talk about the giant King Og, the Nephilim. The Nephilim is King Og. Hey, wait a minute. And King Og's giant bed, which, by the way, they'll probably find someday doing a parking garage excavation in Amman, but that's another story. So here's a case where they're going to find this huge bed. Well, how did the Nephilim and King Og make it? If there was a flood, did they hang on the side of the ark with the fish? I mean, don't you understand these discrepancies? But so you've got this incredible, and in the book of Enoch, there's a story of the Watchers. They're watching us from outer space. Well, so Mr. Prime Minister, those books actually tell a true story. We were the story of the Sumerians and the Anunnaki and the strange Ibis beings that are carved into the Sumerian cuneiform. Yeah, it's true. We were a race that was partially created, hybridized by an extraterrestrial culture, and we have their powers. We can travel back in time. We can move things with our minds. Kind of makes government a little irrelevant. Now, the problem is,
yes, sir,
and we've been telling this story through the media ever since the 1940s and the crash of Roswell, which, by the way, was real. And you know that story in Forbidden Planet about how this race of beings had this enormous intellectual power, the psychic power, but they weren't advanced enough. They weren't like the Vulcans. They weren't advanced enough to control that psychic power. And their own fears destroyed them. They were the Krill from the Forbidden Planet. That's kind of a true story. We already did it. That was us. So that's the truth. Now, Prime Minister, do you want to go on camera and tell that story?
You see, I would, but I understand the political ramifications, especially.
Well, another one. Let's just say that whoever they are that are here, were here, will be here, infiltrated every single government on Earth. All the major powers, industry, Microsoft, you name it, they've infiltrated it. Okay? What if they said, we're not going to be here forever. Let us do what we do. We need some DNA. We need a lot of stuff. Let us get it and get out. We'll just get out. Do whatever you want to do. Don't destroy yourselves. We're not going to let that happen, which is why, by the way, we hang around your nuclear plants. But we're going to get out. Don't blow the whistle. Blow the whistle, game over. We're going to come in like stormtroopers.
Okay, now this makes perfect sense now. Okay.
You feel it?
Yeah, it's like an ultimatum, don't do it, or...
Yeah, I mean, do you want... It's not as if people are going to riot in the streets, but at some point, there will be over the generations, and I'm telling you, I look at this, my model, and I fully believe this, which is why I love to study the history of religion and religious texts. I fully believe that the story of the Israelites in the desert, taking 40 years to make like a month trip, that is a microcosm of truth. Because remember why the Creator said to Moses, this generation's got to die off. He said, they're because they came from Egypt. What did they, when every spy a prince, when the spies from the various tribes went into the land of Canaan, what did they find? They found giants. They found the Nephilim. They brought back grapes as big as volleyballs, basketballs, right? They're carrying these huge branches. This is a grapevine? Oh, looks like a house, right? They said, these guys will kick our butts. We can't beat these guys. But Joshua and Caleb say, oh, no. The Lord said that he would fight for us. Just have faith. No. And they make this line. They say to Moses, let's go back to Egypt. We would rather die as slaves than die in the desert. And Moses is furious and realizes these guys aren't ready. You're not ready to be free. You're not ready to inhabit your land because you have a slave mind. Well, this generation has to die off. And in 40 years, your children, the children of Israel, the Israelites, they'll be ready to inhabit. What if that's the story of us? We are not ready to understand our own nature. Many generations have to pass, and gradually different institutions will filter out the truth. For example, the CIA and other security special access organizations, they filtered out the whole story of alien intervention in earthly affairs. Look at all the movies in the 50s. Look at all the science fiction. You think that suddenly sprang up like, oh, out of nowhere. Wow, that's all right. No. That was brought to them by various powers that be. Gradually. Why did the Vatican suddenly say, well, you know what? If life exists out there in the universe, then the Lord made it, and there you go. We embrace it. What are they going to say? If life is there, there's no life in the universe, when they know there's already life on Mars, they know it because that craft found life, the residue of life, all the way back in 1976. We know from Martian rocks with protein residue that fell to Earth millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, into the ocean that started the life process here. We know. Didn't say human beings sprang from some, but we know that's how life began here. So there was obviously life out there that came here. So what's the church going to say? Oh, if it's out there, God didn't create it. Of course not. Why fly in the face of your own dogma? Therefore, we're gradually being prepared for an announcement that extraterrestrial life exists.
Do you think that disclosure is coming soon?
I think they've already made it. Now they've got to make it again, but I do believe they've been saying it for a while. Buried. I mean, look what NASA just discovered. Fascinating story. Oh, there is a stream of life on Earth that we believe may well be arsenic-based, not carbon-based.
Oh, man, I didn't know about this. You've just
educated me. A couple months ago. Okay. So NASA makes this announcement, okay? Now, then, so is there any correlation? Yes, there is. All the way back in 1947, the United States President Harry Truman learns the Roswell crash, and he says to his chief of staff, you know what? Could you get the Army to take the lowest common denominator of whatever technology exists, the lowest common, not something, not something like Z-ray, but something, and find some place in American industry where they're working on something like this, give it to them and see what they think. So where do they take that lowest common denominator, which would be an integrated circuit? So they take that circuitry, and we're talking about debris here. We're not talking about, a working computer. It's debris. They take it to Bell Labs, Western Electric, where scientists Brattain and Shockley have been trying to come up with a device, a switch that can move electrons across a circuit. Now remember, how did electrons move across a circuit for 100 years before that? Well, the light bulb. Who invented it? Edison, right? Who invented tubes based on the light bulb? Edison, DeForest, the radio tube. Basically, a glass enclosed filament that's vacuum, which is why if you break a light bulb, it explodes. It's a vacuum. And electrons go back and forth inside the vacuum, and that's that's the way electrons pass. Now, what if you could control the number of electrons, one by one? And what if you can control the direction? Turn it on, turn it off. Now you have a switch. With a switch passing electrons through, if you count the electrons, you get something really interesting. You get ones and zeros. But Brattain and Shockley couldn't do it. They couldn't control the electron flow. Then, according to some stories, they got their hands on a chunk of that integrated circuitry from the Roswell crash. They were embedding the poles of this device they were trying to create in pure silicon. And it was just not working.
Wow.
But then what they did was they saw the integrated circuitry was arsenic, and they doped the silicon with arsenic, and that was the key. Crash at Roswell, 1947. Late 1947, first working transistor. 1948, the transistor was patented. 1949, we were all listening to baseball games on our hand-sized transistor radios. That's how fast that was.
Incredible.
Arsenic, and then NASA just discovers arsenic as a way of life. And you talk to people who say they know how the propulsion system works, and the propulsion system on a UFO, one of the navigational systems is it's alive, it's biotronic.
Wow. And this is going to open up a whole new realm. We've got to start to wrap up now, and I apologize for that. But you've got to come back, my friend, without question.
Happy to.
This has been fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Folks, like I said, I've been riveted to my seat, purposely quiet, because when you have a guest on, like Bill Birnes, we're discussing his new book, by the way, you shut up and you listen and you learn, and I've learned a ton tonight.
Brent, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have really a great conversation. Stay warm this winter.
You too, my friend, and we'll get you back right away.
Looking
all
forward.
The very best. Thank you all for listening. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. See you next time.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio.